Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome again to AuthorStory. I'm Alexander Lim, your host, and for this episode, I'm interviewing Michelle Deen, author of the book Saving America's Grace, Rethinking Family Values, Moral Politics, and the Culture War. And for those of you following along who are interested, you can go over now to the Amazon link in the description below the video and check out or get a copy of her book. So, Michelle, welcome to AuthorStory. Thanks a lot for being our guest.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
Cool. So, Michelle, start off. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your author story?
My background is I'm a marriage and family therapist,
Hmm.
specializing in human development and family relations. What that means is, a long time ago, when I decided to go to graduate school, I didn't want to just study psychology in general. I was really interested specifically on how the family impacts our emotional, psychological development.
Mm.
So that is what I focused in on. I am a former adjunct professor of lifespan human development,
Hmm.
and as you've mentioned, the author of this book, Saving America's Grace.
Right. So, about the book, what's the book all about for the benefit of those of us who don't know? And who is it for?
Mm-hmm. Well, the book, I would say, essentially discusses the breakdown of character in politics in our culture
Hmm.
and what we can do about turning that around, both on a cultural, political level, and in families. In particular, that's where I see the most profound impact that we can have on changing our culture. It's helping raise children who are strong, who have a good character, and the children are our future. It'll take generations to change our culture. We have many problems in our culture, which I can get into, and which most people are probably already aware of.
Right, right.
But how do we raise children that are resilient to these influences? So the book is about that, and the book also gets into politics.
Mm.
Uh, and I don't know if you'd like me to discuss the reason that here I am, a marriage and family therapist discussing politics, but I can talk a bit about that if you're interested.
Sure. Just
Yeah.
to get a thumbnail sketch.
Uh-huh. Well, back when George W. Bush was president, particularly in 2004 when he was running for re-election against John Kerry, there was a lot of rhetoric, family values rhetoric, being used to influence voters. They had what they called a wedge issue in the country happening, and that was marriage equality or, quote, gay marriage. And that was, if you look back on all the analysts, how did this happen? George W. Bush was very unpopular. He took us into an unjust war under false pretenses, blah, blah, blah. How did this happen? And all the analysts were saying, well, it was this family values rhetoric. They had framed uh, the debate, so to speak, around families, and they got families fearful about the direction of our culture, the direction of our country, and the impact this would have on children. I mean, they had quotes saying things like, liberals would destroy civilization, and essentially gay marriage would be the end of our civilization.
Mm.
And none of that was true. And the things that they were speaking about were, I felt misleading, maybe not even intentionally, maybe even just because they were misinformed. However, I felt like the conversation happening in this culture needed to change when it came to family values,
Mm.
and I thought, not on my watch.
Okay.
So I started thinking about this book. Marriage equality passed,
Hmm.
and I think it was June of 2015. I thought the opportunity for my book had also passed. I never wrote it, obviously, up until that point. And then Donald Trump came on the scene in, the campaign for 2016, and I thought, oh my goodness, we do need to have a conversation about morality in this culture still today. And, whatever your political persuasion is, the fact of the matter is our kind of social graces, so to speak, had really fallen through the floor.
Hmm.
And I used that opportunity to pick up the ball again and actually this time write the book rather than think about it.
All right, cool. So let's get into a few of the subjects that the book covers. First off, family values.
Mm-hmm.
First off, how would you define family values? First off,
That's a really good question because it's a term that if people were following politics or reading, a lot of the kind of thinking pieces in the news back then, family values was used all the time and it was never really defined. What the implication, though, tends to be is it's usually associated with, quote, traditional family values. And what the implication with that typically means is, the mother, father, kind of the Ozzie and Harriet image of a family.
mm-hmm.
And, who doesn't have fond feelings and nostalgia for kind of a close-knit, warm family? That's all well and good. Also associated with family values, which was never articulated, but really was under what this culture war that was going alongside with family values, was this notion of kind of a return to biblical, principles, which is, the father's in charge of the household, children are supposed to obey, everything is kind of black and white, and this is the way it is. And the reality is a lot of, quote, traditional, which are patriarchal values, have fallen by the wayside in our culture, whether we like it or not. Some of the more, I guess, there's been positive and negative effects from this. Maybe some of the more positive ones are, it wasn't until the 1970s that women could actually apply for a credit card and who could actually say, okay, this is my life and this is how I want to live it. Things like, obviously divorce was frowned upon and, illegal in many cases. There was, spousal abuse was never considered abuse. If you were married, that was between you and your husband, and violence was violence, and it was nobody else's business. That it was not, quote, illegal. Corporal punishment was, much more considered the norm and commonplace for children. But where I was coming from with all of this is knowing what I knew, having worked with families in a clinical setting for over, close to 3 decades, is what I knew for a fact was how a family looked on the surface had nothing to do with how, quote, healthy or happy the family was or the home situation was, and how sound it was for raising children. I worked in a private psychiatric hospital in Boston on the adolescent unit with teenagers who were coming from, it was a private hospital, coming from well-to-do families, doctors, lawyers, Indian chiefs is the way I put it.
Okay.
And they were seriously troubled, the families, and typically the teen is what we call, quote, the identified patient. They were the ones that were kind of screaming out for help. And whenever we, got the whole family together, we would see the problems just rippled through the entire family. It did not, even though this is the person who was hospitalized, because they were breaking fists from punching walls or slitting their wrists or doing all kinds of crazy, unsafe behaviors. The problem was greater than just the child. So I was concerned because all the focus was on how a family was supposed to look,
right,
and that you had a quote traditional family, therefore that equaled good family, and that's not the case. Right. So I wanted to open up the conversation and start talking about the function of the family, which by that I mean the quality of the interpersonal relationships. That is most important. And I would take quality relationships in a homosexual marriage family personally over a dysfunctional heterosexual family any day for raising a child.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so family values, and this is like been carried, like the kind of thing that's been carried on over the ages, like you mentioned, like biblical kind of family, patriarchal kind of thing, and now we're kind of like shifting to something else.
Yeah, yeah. And what I also think is that we're looking for, okay, well, if this doesn't work, or if this, like, quote, traditional family values, when I talk, the traditional looking family,
Right,
you know, man, woman, which, by the way, wasn't even in biblical times because there were, harems and multiple wives and et cetera.
right,
But the traditional looking family isn't the norm today. We have, single parents.
yes,
We have blended families. I don't have to go into all the various types of families there are, but so what is it that we turn to? What do we have? What are the values that we should be, kind of adhering to if our goal is to raise our children optimally?
hmm,
And in the book, I talk about that. It's like, if you want to have values, you have to look at what is your end goal. So you start there. What is your end goal? If your end goal is to raise children optimally, meaning they're eventually able to be self-sufficient, they're solid in who they are, they have good character, they can become good citizens. If you want all of that, what are the values we need to adhere to in order to raise our children that way? So that's how I start out. I'm not here to impose my values on anybody, but I'm saying if that is your goal, this is what the research says. Yeah.
Eh,
So,
go ahead,
mhm,
go ahead.
yeah. So one of the big things that I talk about that kind of busts, one of the myths I bust is we do not want to have obedient children. And people say, oh, what do you mean by that? And what I mean by that is we want to raise children. If your goal is to have, solid, well-functioning kids at the end of the day, at the end of, when they're entering adulthood,
Hmm.
we want to raise children who can actually stand up to what they see as not being right, stand up to peer pressure in high school, to have a solid enough sense of themselves where they have kind of an inner navigation system. They can say, no, that's not right, as opposed to, yes, I'll do whatever you say so that I don't get into trouble. So that's what happens when we raise children who are obedient. What I say, we don't want obedient children if our goal is to have a sound, optimally developed child. We want children who grow up being cooperative. So they learn how to actually get along as citizens. They make the right choices and they feel good from it. I mean, obviously, any kid's going to enjoy misbehaving,
Yeah.
but fundamentally, kids really do want and crave love, acknowledgement, appreciation from their
Mm.
uh, parents. And it's a whole different world when you are standing there, I'm just going to be extreme here, with the belt telling a kid, clean your room,
All right.
as opposed to saying, Johnny, I'd like you to clean your room. It's an absolute mess. No, I don't want to. Well, these are the consequences. You have to do it. This is our rules of family. And, and then there's consequences. And when they do clean their room, it's, thanks so much. I appreciate it. It makes me happy when our home looks neat.
Hmm.
And I feel like you're part of a team here. There's a different way of relating. And the other point that I think what's happened is we've kind of done a pendulum swing where we've gone as a culture from, maybe this kind of obedient, authoritarian parenting model to, oh my gosh, I want to be my kids' friends. I
Right.
feel guilty. I'm not spending enough time with them. I let them get away with murder. I shower them with every last wish that they want materially. That's the whole swing to the other direction, and that's not working either.
Right.
So in the book, I talk about, based on parenting research, the ideal model of parenting is called authoritative parenting, and I talk about what that means. And it's not authoritarian. it's, it's honoring the child, the person that the child is, while setting limits and being sensitive to feelings. And then that's a whole nother area, the emotional world of children, and why that's important to acknowledge and recognize.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, got that. So let's get into the next topic of your book, moral politics. What exactly is this?
Yeah. I don't think we know anymore, do we? And I've been on all kinds of radio programs, many conservative ones, and what I have to say, whether I'm talking to a liberal host, conservative host, is the problem does not begin and end with Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have seen behavior coming from him that, particularly during that campaign, that was jaw-dropping. Mm-hmm. I personally don't want to grow up in a society where people kind of do anything to get to win, to get elected. I appreciate the thought of someone extending a hand when your opponent is down and helping them up, as opposed to kicking the person when they're down. And we saw a lot of kicking, and it was across the board. It wasn't just with Donald Trump. And what I want to say about this is I think politics has been suffering from a lack of moral character for a really long time. Mm-hmm. And the difference we have here with Donald Trump is kind of what you see is what you get. There's no efforts at concealing. The one thing I'll give him, whether it's coming from a healthy place or an unhealthy narcissistic place, either way, one thing I will give him is he says, well, there are questions about how much truth-telling there is, but he doesn't try to hide who he is. Mm-hmm. And there's, just in terms of how money has influenced politics, all the backdoor stuff that really does go into kind of whittling away at the moral integrity of our politicians, that's done in a lot more subtle, insidious way than what we're seeing today. That's been going on forever and ever and ever. Mm. And that's an issue that we need to address, because our politicians are supposed to be the moral leaders for our society. They are supposed to be making the decisions that are serving us in our best interests. And what we have forgotten is that, because there's so much emphasis on getting reelected and on satisfying the people who have money, which I believe that's one of the messages that was very valuable coming out of Bernie Sanders. And I think why he resonated so much with people is he came from a moral core. Whether you agreed with him or not, he had a conviction about what was right and what was wrong. Mm-hmm. And you had the sense that he really was coming at it from that place, and he wanted to fix a broken system. Whether he was capable of doing that or not, I don't know. But that's what I think really spoke to and resonated with a lot of people. Now, in terms of our country, I go into politics in this book, and, which is not my background, but what I learned and how this all fits in with what I'm talking about here is our founders understood that democracy required a high level of moral character. In order to self-govern, think about it, in order to self-govern, we had to have what they called back in those days is virtue, which is kind of a civic duty, a sense of doing right by others. It's the common good that really was one of the foundational pillars of our democracy, is being able to put people in positions that had the common good in mind. And in order to self-govern, you have to have virtue in order to do that. You can't just be, interested in yourself or the people who are supporting your campaigns. That's where the moral fabric, character of our politicians starts to break down. So virtue was a critical component of our democracy, and it goes back to Greek and Roman political philosophy. And that's what we've lost. And I believe that that's why we're on such a shaky foundation politically.
Okay, well, okay, interesting point there. So I'd like to go into the third part, the third topic you
Mm-hmm.
cover, culture war. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for me, a war implies that there are winners and there are losers.
Uh-huh.
Um, is what is going on here with the culture war thing?
Uh-huh. Well, so again, this is just like family values. This was rhetoric that began in the early mid '80s, coming from the GOP side,
Hmm.
and they were concerned about the breakdown of morality in our culture, and it came a lot. The religious right and the Republican Party essentially got into bed together in the late '80s, and they were the religious right with James Dobson. They had a huge money making uh, machine happening, and it's because they were tapping into people whose faith is so important to them, and which is fine. However, what I say about this culture war, which was their attempt to straighten out the culture, essentially by, they don't say this because it's very anti-democratic,
Hmm.
it's borders on theocracy, but by legislating a lot of biblical principles, that was their goal, whether it was, not allowing um, marriage, not allowing same-sex people to marry. It came out of their, religious beliefs that this is wrong. Whether it's about abortion, this came out, which is a tricky one because whether you have religious beliefs or not, it's hard to not, care about potential human life. But that's another one that comes out of that. Prayer in schools, that's another thing that they've been fighting about. Censorship, all of those things were really kind of challenging what democracy is about. And their attempt with this quote culture war was to try to oh darn was try to kind of fix the culture by legislating, by creating laws that kept everybody and everything in place as they saw it should be.
Hmm.
And what I'm saying is, okay, we live in a democracy, and all of that doesn't work. We're not in a quasi theocracy here. We can't be legislating because whose religion are we going to be legislating? We just can't do that.
Right.
So what I'm saying is, we don't need a culture war. We need a cultural evolution.
Hmm.
What I mean by that is, we all need to develop, evolve as people spiritually in whatever way that means, because ultimately, if we get rid of all the dogma and the doctrine, whatever religion it is that you believe in, ultimately religion is intended to be a tool to become a better human being. And if we can focus on that element, we can evolve as a culture.
Hmm.
Who doesn't want to live in a society where people adhere to the golden rule?
Right.
That sounds pretty good to me. Who doesn't want to live in a culture that has empathy? Who doesn't want to live in a culture where you put human values, and here's where I think we kind of break down, human values ahead of capitalistic values.
Hmm.
And I see that we've kind of become, as a culture, we've kind of begun to value the bottom line over the human line. So um, that's 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 gotten us off track. And um, as a culture, if we can get back to becoming better human beings in that way, and again, it has to do with how we help our children navigate this culture that we're in, where everything is about what you buy and the celebrities that you're watching on reality TV, and it's kind of crazy. I talk about all the abnormal norms in our culture that have become so normal, we don't even realize they're abnormal anymore.
Right.
And I don't know, it's like, for example, we watch news shows where people are shouting at each other as opposed to reporting facts.
Mm-hmm.
We watch reality TV as a source of entertainment that is, as opposed to being really concerned about what's happening in other parts of the world. How many people have died in this war that's happening in the Middle East? Why is that not grabbing our attention? Why is, what type of purse Kim Kardashian is carrying? Why is that grabbing our attention? And why are we interested in all these petty fights that people are having on reality TV when there's real conflict with serious consequences happening in the world? Why do we have these images of the perfect body that are photoshopped and aren't anything real? We've kind of lost track of our internal navigation system about what's right and what's normal and what's not.
Right. Okay. Cool. Got that. Interesting. So, Michelle, in closing, then, I would just like to mention the book is Saving America's Grace, Rethinking Family Values, Moral Politics, and the Culture War. The authors are guest Michelle Deen, and you can find her book on Amazon. Michelle, in the last minute or so, is there any other place that they might find more information about you and the book?
Well, yeah, I go into a lot of detail about various topics on my website, which is michelledeen.com. But the book really gets into, I would say, the parenting piece. And my next book, which I haven't begun yet, will focus solely on the family, and it won't have this political angle. But I felt like, given where our culture is today, I wanted to kind of comment on that. But yeah, this half an hour went by really quickly. And yeah, there's so much to say, but I appreciate you having me on.
Cool. And thanks for your time. Thanks for being an author story. It was, I must say, it was very insightful having you with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Alex. My pleasure.
Cool. So if any of you listeners want to know more about this topic, please feel free to go ahead and check out Michelle's book, Saving America's Grace, by going to the Amazon link in the description below the video. And if you'd like to follow our author interviews on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. So bye for now, everyone. I'll be back on Author Story next time with another inspiring author.